portion of the digestive system. So what we're really going to be looking at here, we're going to review again what the stomach does, but we're going to really focus on this first portion of the small intestine, because that is also a major site of digestion. It's called the duodenum. Okay, we're going to label all of these. Don't you worry. We'll get there, and we'll also talk about their functions. All right? There's a bunch of different colored stuff here. We'll get there. But first things first, let's review what happens when we swallow food. Okay, when we swallow food, first we masticate it in the mouth. We physically digest it because our teeth grind it and break it down. We're also mixing that food with saliva, which has amylase in it. And amylase breaks down carbohydrates, or it starts to. It cannot fully break them down. Okay, our tongue moves that to the back of our throat, and our throat constricts, pushing it down into our esophagus. We don't choke on it because of the epiglottis that gets pushed down. It's a very flimsy flap of cartilage. It gets pushed down over the trachea, prevents food from entering the windpipe, correct? Okay, so I've drawn the esophagus here, and I'm going to label all this in a moment. Now, what I want to know, what is the little doorway that blocks or divides or separates the esophagus from the stomach? So if we look at this diagram now, we've labeled the esophagus, and I've enlarged that little doorway or that barrier between the esophagus and the stomach. Okay, it is a ring of muscle called a sphincter, and that one is specifically called the lower esophageal sphincter because it's found on the lower end of the esophagus. Its natural state is the lower of those two rings. It's always closed. The only time it opens up is when it senses food on the other side of it that's got to get into the stomach. Okay? So what ends up happening here, that opens up, and as soon as the food passes that sphincter, it closes up again. And it needs to do this. Why? Why does it need to stay closed all the time? So as soon as food enters the stomach, it falls into basically a small football-sized organ. In some people, the stomach is larger than in others, but it's got kind of that different sort of shape to it, all right? And the stomach has two roles. The stomach's first role is, of course, digestion. Its job is to break down food, all right? The second thing that the stomach is really good at is it stores food. It keeps it in there, and it keeps mixing it up and breaking it down until there's room in the remainder of the digestive system for it. So it acts as a storage facility as well. All right? Mucus is super important in the stomach because we have a pH in the esophagus of about 7.4 pH, whereas here we've got a pH of about 2. Okay, huge difference here. And we remember, hopefully from grade 7, that the pH scale is logarithmic, which means it works on the power of 10. So 2 to 7 is about 5 steps, correct? 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7. You cannot say that the stomach is 5 times more acidic an environment than the esophagus. It's 10 to the 5 times more acidic. So it is, what is that, like 100,000 times more acidic. The cells that line the esophagus are not equipped to deal with that acidity. Okay, so as much as possible, the stomach is really good at keeping that acid contained. But here's the deal. How does the acid get created? What kind of acid is it? Does anybody know? Hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid has two specific functions in the stomach. Number one, it finishes the digestion of carbohydrates. And number two, it starts the chemical digestion of fats. Okay, so the third really important substance in the stomach is in charge of breaking down or starting to break down proteins into their amino acids. Because a protein is a large molecule. It cannot be absorbed into the bloodstream in that large state. We've got to break it down into those individual little amino acids that were all linked together to make the protein. Okay? So it's kind of counterintuitive that when our body makes these things, it takes energy to make these long chains, and then we've got to turn around and break these chains up again when we consume them. That leads to some of the inefficiency in living organisms. We are not 100% efficient. We waste a tremendous amount of energy. Okay? But does anybody know what the substance is called that is in charge of breaking down proteins? Pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme, which is kind of funny. It's a protein. It's a protein that breaks up proteins. Okay? And to remember what it's called, you can think of the letter P. Pepsin breaks up proteins. Okay? They both start with P. So there's some pepsin that is secreted by the cells that line the stomach. And it's spit into the inside of the stomach. And as that physically gets smushed and mixed around, it mixes in with all the food and it attacks individual proteins. Pepsin does nothing to fats and it does nothing to carbohydrates. Okay? But it does break down proteins. So we've added some brown stuff into the stomach. Okay?